Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and today I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm going to talk about some house rules that I use. Now, as many of you know, I have a blog at oneshotadventures.com, and it's home to over 35 free adventures, all set in various genres. And while most of them, all of them, are built for multiple game systems, the one system that's always there is GURPS. Now, this is a system along with Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons & Dragons that I grew up with, and one that me and my friends can easily come back to, especially if we're in the mood to try a brand new genre or world without learning a whole new rules system. I love that GURPS lets me play everything from Lord of the Rings to Reacher without too much effort. But GURPS, while it does have a simple set of core rules, just roll 3d6 under your attribute or skill, has a reputation for crazy complexity and mind-boggling number of options to flip on and off. And while I take exception to the people who explain all of that complexity away with, well, GURPS is a toolkit, just use what you want, I think it takes a long time to figure out just how to do that. But I do think that there are a number of common sense things that you can do out of the box to streamline your GURPS gameplay, without having to think about the game design implications of every single choice you make. So to help you newer GURPS GMs out there, here are my favorite house rules that I use to streamline GURPS combat. Quick disclaimer that some of these aren't actually house rules, but rules that I've taken from some of the more obscure GURPS supplements. Okay, here we go. Number 1, use range bands. The standard GURPS range chart is very granular. There are 5 range penalties alone, just from point blank range to 15 yards away. Even when I'm playing over virtual tabletop, which measures ranges in just 2 clicks of a button, the constant measurement slows my games down. And if you're not using a grid, like you're playing Theater of the Mind, well then you as a GM have to constantly make up very exact ranges. How far are those stormtroopers on the hill? Well, are they 70 yards away or 100 yards away? You gotta figure that out because that does make a difference. The solution for this is buried in GURPS Monster Hunters 2 and a few other supplements, which simplifies the range penalties to what you normally see in RPGs: short, medium, long, and extreme range. This makes it so much easier for players and GMs to run combat, and it doesn't require a hex grid to play out a good fight. Oh, and if you do use range bands, then you can use the cool newfangled terrain options like Ultimate Dungeon Terrain, which just creates zones for like long, medium, and short range. And your players always love that. It's my GURPS version of Ultimate Dungeon Terrain. If there's ever a 5th edition of GURPS, I really hope that this becomes the standard rule for measuring range and that the granular speed range chart that exists today just gets pushed to an appendix for people who want a lot more detail in their RPGs. Number 2, simplify your bad guy tactics. GURPS is one of the few systems that has 2 separate roles for attacking and defending, which means that there's a decent chance of a common opponent like an orc parrying or dodging your hero's attack. I actually don't have a problem with this. To me, it makes fights feel more real. But if you're running a lot of opponents in your fight, well, it can really slow the game down. Sometimes I want my heroes fighting against 20 skeletons or orcs without rolling so many defenses every turn. The simple way to handle this is just to rule that mooks, common untrained enemies, they always all-out attack. In GURPS, this means that they lose all those defensive rolls, they don't get to dodge or parry or block, and they get in exchange a nice little attack bonus like +4 to hit or +2 damage. The danger of your fights will stay the same, it'll still be deadly, but this speeds up your fights dramatically without all of that excess rolling. Note that I still do use defenses for any trained opponents like lieutenants or soldiers, etc. It's just the more untrained thugs that just all out attack and lose their defenses and then go down easier when the players train their sights on them. Similarly, by the way, I don't bother to make health rolls for most opponents once they fall below 0 hit points, unless they're true killers. I just rule that the bad guy has given up fighting, he's either surrendered or he's bleeding out, or maybe he just tries to run away. The kind of willpower needed to fight into the death just really doesn't happen when I play my games, except with truly epic, well-trained bad guys. Number 3, use impulse points. About half the GURPS games that I run are realistic and gritty, and the other half are more action pulp, where I want players to take more risks. But combating GURPS is deadly. One failed defense roll, and you can be splattered by like a single rifle shot. For some campaigns like horror or military action, well, that's a feature, and I find that it encourages players to use tactics and be careful. But if I'm playing in a game that I want to feel more like Indiana Jones or Star Wars, well, I don't really want my players like hiding behind rocks all the time. The solution to this is called impulse points. And this is sort of mentioned in the basic set, but really expanded in the Impulse Buys supplement. There's a ton of ways to do this, but here's what I do. First, I give my players in cinematic campaigns 1 impulse point per 50 character points. So typically a character will start with 3 of them. They're standalone points, they're not character points, so players never have that awful choice of wasting a point and not getting to improve their character later. I really hate making characters and players make those choices. I think that that's kind of dumb. But spending 1 impulse point will reduce any hit to a flesh wound. The character just takes 1 hit point of damage. I also usually let them use a point to flip a failure into a success, but what's important is you let the players recharge those points every session. This one tweak makes your players suddenly go from being very careful to taking risks much more. And it also makes certain technology levels with guns much more survivable. Again, I don't use this for every game, just the ones where I want it to have more of an action feel, where I want the players to take risks. So if you want a game like that, or you're bothered by how deadly GURPS can be for the style of game you want to play, then just go ahead and introduce my 3 impulse points rule. Number 4, ignore some rules. This one's sort of a catch-all for all the rules that I don't use. It's one of my other problems when people say GURPS is a toolkit, because the GURPS books don't really make any recommendations on like what happens when you start omitting rules. I've seen some players say they're going to delete the rules about cutting and impaling damage, doing bonus damage, but that kind of like really starts wrecking the game system. So you have to know what you're doing before you start adding and subtracting rules from GURPS. But here's some of the ones that I don't use in almost any game. First, I don't allow acrobatic dodges, except in really cinematic campaigns, and even then I make it cost 1 fatigue point. Getting a +2 to your defense roll just slows combat down too much. I find that it takes the danger away from PCs, and basically everyone who has a high dex, which is a lot of combat characters, end up taking acrobatics just for that. So in a game like GURPS, which is supposed to be realistic by default, I'm not even sure what acrobatic dodge is supposed to represent. Can you really do like a flip dodge roll thing in 1 second of time? So I don't know, I don't like it, so I omit it. I don't use extra effort in combat rules either. I find that players will always spend a fatigue point to get +2 defenses every single turn, because characters usually start with at least 10 fatigue, and most GURPS combats don't even last 10 turns. So again, I find that giving that bonus to defenses just really slows the game down. I also don't use facing rules, but I just hand wave like a generic -2 defense penalty from attacks that come from somebody's side. I also force players to jump back, this is the retreating dodge, directly away from their opponents versus to the side, which is technically allowed by the rules. And I find that requiring a direct jump back just makes melee combat a little bit more tactically interesting. Eventually, if you keep doing it, you get back into a wall or you'll slam into somebody else. And speaking of that, I also don't use the slam rules as written. I find they're clunky and take too much calculation. Dungeon Fantasy actually does a better job of simplified slam rules. If you like that, go ahead and use those. And I rarely use knockback rules unless there's like a big strong enemy like an ogre involved. It's just too many optional little rules that I find slow the game down. So I almost never use any of those rules. If you're new to GURPS and you just want to summarize what I just said, I guess I would say start with the combat rules that you can find in the free GURPS Lite, and don't add anything else until you have a few sessions under your belt and you really kind of get a sense of how you want combat to flow for your group. Number 5, time dilation. Okay, so this is probably my most sophisticated and craziest house rule. GURPS is often criticized for its 1-second turns, while other RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons have 6-second turns, and Call of Cthulhu actually has turns that are whatever the GM rules. On the plus side, GURPS' 1-second combat turns makes the game feel more real and tactical, like every single attack, swing, dodge, and parry is captured in a GURPS combat. And like when you're playing a fantasy scenario, well, they feel like that one in Fellowship of the Ring. They have a cave troll. And in a modern game, getting fired upon by a thug with an AK-47, which can fire 10 bullets per second, is a big, scary deal. Now, many times, the short turn just changes the tactics. When it takes a minute or 60 turns to load a pirate-era flintlock pistol, well, all this actually does is encourage your pirate players to carry 2 pistols, shoot them both, and then charge into combat with their cutlasses.
I've done that maneuver like 30 times. It's hardly a thing at all.
To me, that's a feature. That feels the way pirates should fight. Way more than someone firing every other turn in D&D, which just hand waves all that real-life loading time in favor of empowering ranged characters. Like, yeah, it plays a little faster, might be more satisfying, but suddenly your combats don't feel like pirates when you're not enforcing the long loading times. But on the flip side, I will completely concede that the 1-second turn does sometimes get in the way of a fun combat encounter. For example, a few weeks ago, I was running Professor Dungeon Master's Macbeth adventure. This is a fantastic and perfect adventure to port to GURPS. It's based on Macbeth. It's fun, it's gritty, it's really perfect. Check it out. On one dark, cold night in the castle, one of my players decided to sneak upstairs to go spy on Lady Macbeth. Meanwhile, the other players who were sleeping in the Great Hall were suddenly ambushed by a vicious demon. Now, technically, that scouting player was probably at least 30 seconds away from the combat. He was like up the stairs in a tower. So rules as written in GURPS, there was zero chance that this player would get back to the fight on time to participate. No combat in GURPS takes 30 seconds. That situation is boring for that player who now has to watch an entire combat play out without him. And yeah, he made a choice, but the choice was a small one. He's like, I'll sneak upstairs. And this is not what would typically happen in a good narrative, where that scout would rush back to the action, like just in time to get involved or maybe in the middle of the fight. And by the way, I don't think this is especially realistic, since GURPS doesn't capture any of the circling respites and natural breaks that happen in a typical fight. It's generally 1 second per turn of people beating on each other, and there's none of those breaks that might really happen. Or in another example, let's say in a more cinematic game, if my swashbuckling pirate wants to climb up a ladder, leap off the balcony, swing on a chandelier, and dramatically land in front of the king, well, that's probably never going to happen in the middle of a GURPS fight, because that series of events that I just described could easily take up to 10 seconds to pull off. Or if a player is heroically lockpicking a door while his friends hold off a horde of kobolds, well, that situation doesn't work well in GURPS, because picking a lock could take, 60 seconds? Just not going to work. The easiest way to fix this potential issue is through what I call time dilation. Time dilation is where you as a GM subjectively allow longer actions versus being a slave to the second-by-second turns. Just use the phrase, "there's a break in the fight," to let the players do something fun or important. So in my Macbeth example, when the scout's friends get ambushed, I say that he heard the skirmish and started running. Meanwhile, his friends stood up, they circled the room with their opponent, they stared at each other angrily, maybe exchanged a few words, and then combat began. Then I can say that the scout will arrive maybe a few turns into this fight has begun, not 30 turns later. I basically just dilated the time to allow a lot of actions to play out that weren't critical to the dramatic tension, just so that that player could get involved. Or in my chandelier example, I just thought that the player's idea was so cool, I just said, we're going to fast forward a little bit. We're going to say that that player was able to fly up the ladder, mount the balcony, and leap off. And sure, there was fighting going around with his friends and the opponents, but it was all parrying and circling, and it didn't matter. He had the time to go do that. No one complains about this. Nobody goes, oh, well, it's not fair that if he ran up the balcony and jumped off the stairs, I should be able to do something else crazy. Yeah, this breaks the rules, but it makes for a more fun and interesting combat for your players. The only one who should complain about this system are the bad guys, and who cares what they think?
Well, of course the bad guys are bloody angry. I had a TPK all planned here. I had a nuclear winter fireball ready to go, and suddenly I get backstabbed by some rogue who was like 30 minutes away. I mean, what the f***?
Obviously, you have to be judicious about this. You can't do it constantly, and you have to only use it when it feels right. And if you want to be less hand-wavy about this, then you can use a slightly different version of what I just described. You can roll a single 6-sided die every single turn. On a roll of 6, then 6 seconds pass in the combat, where all the combatants take a breath, they hurl some insults, they maybe reload their guns, or they reposition themselves a little bit. Let your players use those 6 seconds to take a move action on the map to represent how they're maneuvering around. Or you could do something more advanced, like give them a tactics roll, and then they can have a couple moves. But in those 6 seconds, well, this gives breaks to those players who are in the middle of a longer action, without it relying completely on GM fiat. So now, your player can lockpick that door, or run up the ladder to the chandelier, or switch weapons, or pull out a potion and drink it. And this also lets you use that time dilation for your bad guys' longer actions, like they can now call in reinforcements from a nearby room, or they can move closer to that hidden door in the room so they can make their escape. All of this can basically be summed up. Remember that you're the GM and that you can fast forward time when it makes for a more fun game for you and your players. But just do it fairly, and your combats will run much smoother. And your players won't get frustrated by the fact that it can take so many turns to do some basic things in GURPS. And those are my 5 favorite house rules for GURPS combat. I've played GURPS a long time now, 35 years or so I'm very comfortable with the changes that I make to the game. But obviously these rules aren't going to be to everyone's liking. But I'd love to hear what your favorite house rules are, especially for combat. Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, speaking in GURPS takes up no time during the turn, so in theory, you could have listened to this whole video in just 1 second.